he found his family murdered. But was he the victim or the killer? On a quiet evening in Georgetown, Indiana, a single 911 call would unravel one of the most perplexing cases in state history. A former state trooper returned home to find his wife and 2 children murdered. Was he a grieving husband or a cold-blooded killer? As investigators pieced together the scene, a strange detail, an overlooked sweatshirt, held the answer all along. But justice isn't always about the truth. Welcome to X Confidential, where we uncover the most shocking true crime stories and wrongful conviction cases. Thank you for tuning in. If you love real crime and forensic mysteries, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an update. Now, let's dive into this incredible case that took over a decade to uncover the truth. It was a fall evening in Georgetown, Indiana, that would change a family forever. On September 28th, 2000, just after 9:30 p.m., a call came into the Sellersburg State Police Post that would launch one of the most complex investigations in Indiana history. In the garage of a comfortable suburban home, officers found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. Camm, a 35-year-old mother, lay on the garage floor near the family's Ford Bronco. In the backseat, officers discovered her 2 children, 7-year-old Brad and 5-year-old Jill, still strapped in their seatbelts. All 3 had been shot to death. The person who called 911 was David Camm, a former Indiana State Trooper who had left the force just months earlier. He told police he had been playing basketball at a nearby church from 7 p.m. until shortly before discovering his family. When he came home, he said he found his wife's body on the floor. Looking inside the Bronco, he saw his children.
You should go look at that.
Believing his son might still be alive since he had no visible head wounds, Camm said he pulled Brad from the vehicle and attempted CPR. The initial evidence was puzzling. Camm's shoes were placed neatly on top of the Bronco, an unusual detail in what appeared to be a violent crime scene. Inside the darkened garage, evidence technicians worked through the night, collecting blood samples, fingerprints, and fibers, but it was what they didn't find that first night that would later break the case wide open. The medical examiner determined all 3 victims died from gunshot wounds. Brad had been shot in the chest, while Kim and Jill suffered fatal head wounds. Based on body temperature and other factors, the time of death was estimated to be around 8 p.m., a crucial detail that investigators would need to verify against witness statements. As rain began to fall outside the Camm residence, investigators knew they needed to work quickly to preserve any evidence that might help them understand what happened to this young family. The investigation's first major twist came from a crime scene photographer named Rob Stites. He told police there were 2 critical pieces of evidence, what appeared to be signs of cleanup in the garage and tiny drops of blood on David Camm's t-shirt. These drops, he claimed, were high-velocity impact spatter, the kind that only comes from being very close to a gunshot. But questions about the evidence began almost immediately. The unusual blood patterns that Stites thought showed a cleanup attempt turned out to be something much simpler. Just the natural way blood separates when it's been sitting out for a while, and those tiny drops on the t-shirt. Other experts would later say there weren't nearly enough of them to match what typically happens during a shooting. The investigation turned to David Camm's alibi. 11 people said they were playing basketball with him at the church from 7 p.m. until after 9 p.m. that night. But investigators thought they found a hole in his story when they discovered a phone call made from the Camm house at 7:19 p.m. If Camm was at basketball, who made that call? Then came another surprise. The phone company revealed they had made a mistake. Because of Indiana's complicated time zones, the call was actually made at 6:19 p.m. before the basketball game started. This meant David Camm's alibi for the estimated time of the murders, around 8 p.m., was still intact. Among the evidence collected that first night was a gray sweatshirt found in the garage. At first, it didn't seem important, but DNA testing would reveal something unexpected: blood from Camm, along with DNA from 2 other people who weren't part of the Camm family. The sweatshirt also had a name written in the collar, Backbone. Despite running the DNA through their database, investigators couldn't find a match. The identity of the person who wore that sweatshirt remained a mystery that would take years to solve. The basketball players at Georgetown Community Church became key witnesses in the investigation. Their statements painted a detailed picture of that evening: men gathering for their regular Thursday night game, playing full-court basketball in shirts and skins. David Camm, whom they said was there the whole time. But investigators faced a challenging question: could someone slip away from a basketball game without being noticed? They brought in experts to study the timing. Each basketball game lasted about 7 minutes. Between games, players would take water breaks, catch their breath, and wait their turn to play again. The church gym's layout became important evidence. 2 sets of doors led outside. Security lights lit up the parking lot. Players took breaks on benches along the court. Could someone leave through those doors, drive the 5 minutes to the Camm house, commit the murders, and return without the other players noticing? To answer this question, investigators interviewed every player multiple times. They wanted to know exactly who played in each game, who sat out, and who took breaks. Memories varied. Some players remembered Camm sitting out a couple of games, while others insisted he played most of the night. One detail stood out. Several players remembered Camm complaining about sweating through his shirt. He had changed into a dry shirt sometime during the evening. This caught investigators' attention because it might explain why he changed clothes. Meanwhile, detectives were building a timeline of the Camm family's last movements. Surveillance video showed Camm and the children at a pool around 7 p.m. Brad had swimming practice. This meant they couldn't have arrived home before 7:30 p.m., narrowing down the window of time when the murders occurred. But the investigators' timeline had a problem. The medical examiner put the time of death around 8 p.m., right in the middle of the basketball games, where 11 people said they saw David Camm playing. The investigation took a dramatic turn when the blood evidence became the center of the case. Rob Stites, who had first noticed the blood drops on David Camm's shirt, claimed they proved he was present during the shootings. But there was a shocking revelation. Stites wasn't actually a blood spatter expert at all. He was just a crime scene photographer. Despite this problem, other analysts examined the shirt. They found 8 tiny drops of blood, each smaller than a pencil point. The prosecution's experts said these drops could only come from being close to the gunshots. But defense experts disagreed completely. They said the blood probably got on the shirt when Camm leaned into the Bronco to pull out his son Brad. To test these different theories, experts on both sides conducted experiments. They shot guns at blood-filled wigs to see what patterns the blood would make. They pushed against bloody surfaces to see how blood transfers from one thing to another. Each side came up with different results that supported their view of what happened. The prosecution built their first theory. They believed Camm came home after basketball, shot his family, and tried to clean up the scene before calling for help. They pointed to his history of marital problems as a possible motive. But this theory had problems. The timeline didn't match the medical examiner's findings, and the phone call that seemed suspicious turned out to be nothing. In March 2002, prosecutors took their case to trial anyway. Their main evidence was the blood spatter on the shirt. The defense brought in their own experts who said the prosecution's blood evidence was all wrong. They pointed to the 11 basketball players who said Camm was with them when the murders happened. But something else was happening behind the scenes. Something that would change everything about the case. Unknown to everyone at the time, the answer to who killed the Camm family was sitting in an evidence locker in the form of that mysterious gray sweatshirt with backbone written in the collar. Early 2005, a crucial piece of evidence finally got the attention it deserved. Defense attorneys demanded another look at the DNA found on the gray sweatshirt from the crime scene. Even though prosecutors had claimed they'd thoroughly investigated all DNA evidence, they hadn't actually run one of the DNA samples through the database. When they finally did run the test, they got a hit. The DNA belonged to a man named Charles Boney, a convicted felon from nearby New Albany. But this wasn't just any criminal. Boney had a very specific history that made investigators take notice. Boney had earned a disturbing nickname during his criminal career, the Shoe Bandit. He had a history of attacking women and stealing their shoes. He'd been released from prison just months before the Camm murders. This detail became important because of how Camm's shoes were found, carefully placed on top of the Bronco in the middle of a violent crime scene. More evidence emerged. A palm print on Camm's Bronco, which had never been identified, matched Charles Boney's hand. Investigators also found his girlfriend's DNA mixed with the victim's blood on the sweatshirt. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. The sweatshirt had been photographed and collected the night of the murders, but no one had noticed something crucial. Written in the collar was not just the word backbone, but also a Department of Corrections number. That number belonged to Charles Boney. When questioned, Boney failed a polygraph test, but his story kept changing. First, he said he had donated the sweatshirt to charity. Then he admitted being at the Camm house that night, but gave different versions of what happened. Each time investigators talked to him, the story shifted. The physical evidence was mounting. DNA from an ex-convict with a history of attacking women, his palm print at the scene, and his prison-marked sweatshirt covered in the victim's blood. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a troubling revelation. This evidence had been in their hands since the very first night. With Charles Boney's DNA identified, the case took a dramatic new turn. But rather than replace their original theory, prosecutors came up with a new one. They suggested Boney and David Camm had worked together. However, they couldn't find any evidence that Camm and Boney had ever met before the murders. When questioned, Boney told investigators a story that would change several times. He claimed he went to the Camm house to sell a gun wrapped in the gray sweatshirt. But there was a problem with his timeline. According to other witnesses, Camm and the children were at the swimming pool when Boney claimed to be at their house. More troubling evidence emerged about Boney's story. His girlfriend, Molly Mattingly, told police that Boney came home after midnight, in light of the murders, breathing hard and sweating. She said he had a scraped knee and showed her a gun. The next morning, she said, Boney asked her to watch the news about the murders. By the third trial in 2013, new DNA technology revealed even more. Touch DNA testing found Boney's DNA on Camm's clothing, in places that contradicted his story about never touching the victims. His DNA was found on Camm's underwear, on her broken fingernail, and on Jill's shirt, evidence that suggested a violent struggle. The investigation had come full circle. 13 years after the murders, technology and persistence finally revealed what evidence from the first night had been trying to tell them. That gray sweatshirt, overlooked in the initial investigation, had held the key all along. During the first trial in 2002, prosecutors focused heavily on the blood spatter evidence and brought in testimony about Camm's past marital infidelity. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 195 years in prison. But in 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned this conviction. They ruled that bringing in testimony from women about Camm's affairs and alleged flirtations had unfairly prejudiced the jury. Rather than release Camm, prosecutors immediately charged him again. The second trial in 2006 took a different approach. since they couldn't use the affairs as evidence anymore. Prosecutors introduced a new theory. They claimed Camm had molested his daughter Jill and killed his family to cover it up. Their evidence was a single injury found on Jill's body. Defense medical experts countered that this was just one of many injuries the child received during the attack that killed her. In this second trial, prosecutors also brought in Charles Boney as a witness. Boney testified that Camm was the shooter, though his story had changed multiple times during the investigation. The jury convicted Camm again, and he was sentenced to life without parole. And in 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned this second conviction. The court ruled there was no evidence to support the molestation allegations, which had severely prejudiced the jury against Camm. The third trial in 2013 would be dramatically different. This time, prosecutors tried to argue that even if Camm wasn't the shooter, he had helped Boney commit the murders. But they faced a serious problem. There was still no evidence that Camm and Boney had ever met before the murders. The new touch DNA evidence also showed Boney had been in much closer contact with the victims than he had admitted. On October 24, 2013, after 3 trials and 13 years in prison, David Camm was found not guilty. Charles Boney was convicted of the murders and sentenced to 225 years in prison. The case became a stark example of how tunnel vision in an investigation can lead police down the wrong path, while the real killer's evidence sits in plain sight. Each trial cost taxpayers millions of dollars. The total cost of prosecuting and defending the case reached an estimated $4.5 million. During his time in prison between trials, Camm never stopped maintaining his innocence. He spent 13 years behind bars before finally being acquitted. After his release, Camm filed lawsuits against Floyd County and the state of Indiana. He settled with Floyd County for $450,000. In 2022, after a long legal battle, he was awarded over $5 million in settlements from the various lawsuits.
Very cool.
Today, Camm works as a case coordinator for Investigating Innocence, a national nonprofit that helps investigate potential wrongful convictions. He has developed a friendship with several jurors from his third trial who became convinced of his innocence during the proceedings. The case has become a textbook example of wrongful conviction that is now studied in forensic science programs. It highlights the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, the unreliability of certain forensic techniques like blood spatter analysis, and the importance of thoroughly investigating all physical evidence from the start. Thanks for watching X by X Confidential. What do you think? Was justice finally served, or did the system fail? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love true crime content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into another unbelievable case.